This is a podcast by Householders Options to Protect the Environment, Hope Australia. We are a community environmental education and capacity building organisation based in Toowoomba, southeast Queensland, Australia. This is a podcast in the series Eco-Social Work in Australia. It was produced for Hope Australia in Toowoomba, Queensland, on and adjacent to the traditional lands of the Djarawar, Giabal, Yugara and Waka Waka peoples. Hope pays respect to the past, present and emerging leaders of all First Nations people in this country and acknowledges the unique contribution that their cultures make to contemporary Australia. Hello, my name is Andrew Nicholson and I am the producer of the Eco-Social Work in Australia podcast series. Stimulated by the increased interest in eco-social work ideas occurring from around 2017, a number of branches of the Australian Association of Social Workers, the AASW, the peak organisation in this country, started to collate and share eco-social work ideas and practice and to network this information with colleagues. My podcast guest today, Beni McKenzie, is a social worker in mainstream practice in the Gold Coast region of southeast Queensland. He is Vice President of the AASW South Queensland Branch and a member of the AASW National Advisory Panel on Climate Change. Within the last few years, Beni has been active in finding ways to embed eco-social work practice principles into his mainstream work and to find opportunities to spread the word on eco-social work approaches to his colleagues and other social workers at local, regional and national levels. He talks with me today about some of his activities and ideas relevant to this work. So, Beni, welcome and great to talk with you today.
Thanks, Andrew. Thank you. How are you?
Yeah, fine. It's still a bit chilly where I'm podcasting from, but it's great to know there's still some cold weather to be experienced. Look, I want to start the conversation today, as with other podcast guests, by asking you to introduce yourself more fully. You know, you've got a very full CV, a lot of professional experience. Perhaps give us some milestones of your professional background and also some idea about when and how you first became aware of the potential for the physical environmental dimension within social work practice, and as part of that still evolving body of eco-social work occurring within the professional mainstream here in Australia.
Yeah, sure. I grew up on Turrbal land up on the north side of Brisbane, and I don't know, I feel like I've had a kind of a hankering for justice since I was a real young fella, and I kind of went off the rails a bit when I was teenage, late teens, early 20s, and came back from that and thought I needed something to give back a little bit and found social work, and that really gave a voice to some of my hunger for justice that I'd always felt, I think. In terms of green or eco social work stuff, I think it's just an extension for justice to me. I saw a presentation by Dr. Jennifer Body at a AASW conference years ago, and that really brought home the social work angle around climate change in terms of weather events affecting people proportionate basically to their level of privilege, and therefore the disadvantage impact there. And I read Lena Dominelli's book, Green Social Work, pretty early on. I think probably the year it was published. And that I like that book a lot. I think I like how it kind of aims for practical tasks in the book itself. And that just got me thinking, and I've been involved in some of the protest movement stuff around Stop Adani and those sorts of groups, Beyond Zero Emissions. And it's just trying to do as much as you can toward society as a whole, dealing with climate change that we're facing. You just do a bit here and there, and I think the justice aspect of social work really fits in well with that.
Yeah, so interesting to hear, not necessarily in any order, but drawing upon some of the early theories coming out of some of the key thinkers, in social work. Dominelli, you mentioned Jennifer Body here in Australia, but then you making some links to, existing activism interests or ongoing campaigns. So let's just firm that up a bit more now by coming to the sort of core, one of the first one of the 4 core questions that I put in each of these interviews. This first one for you, you've just started to touch upon it, but for you specifically, what does eco-social work practice mean for you in 2021? What are some of its key ideas, principles, and approaches in your view?
Yeah, well, I think eco-social work, and I know at the moment there's kind of a few phrases that get bandied around in terms of what it's actually called. A colleague recently introduced me to the term eco-kin, which I really like, and I think that was a English language version of trying to capture that Indigenous spirit of connection with country. But yeah, whatever it's called, I think to me it's really a full use of systems mapping. Obviously, as social workers, that's core to what we do. And, we talk about micro, meso, macro domains of practice, all those sorts of things in the theory side of our work. And I think climate and natural environment is the overarching framework in which all other issues take place. So it's the most macro of macro systems, and without a healthy environment, we can't live. So, that requires a healthy relationship with the environment. And that's also, relationship is so core to social work. So I think justice applied through that use of systems mapping and really looking at a holism that includes environment. I think justice applied there can ripple through everything. You can talk about property ownership, land management, public transport, the building codes, food production, all climate action, I suppose, has effects through all those systems. So I think it's eco-social work practice is really about applying justice and system theory to the human impact on climate and the impact of that climate change on us then, especially in terms of it affecting disadvantaged groups differently.
And this links quite nicely into the next question, but you've already said that you became aware of more specifically the social work and climate change link, through some of the theorists talking about that in the Australian context, like people like Body, etc. But trying to drill down a bit more, firm this up again a bit more specifically from your perspective, how can eco-social work intervention help tackle climate change and other sustainable development challenges in practical on-the-ground terms? Have you got any sort of thoughts about that in terms of your own work and
yeah, well, I think again, social work are, systems thinking or systems designers. I think you're talking about managing mass change. I mean, I've heard it said something about, someone said something about COVID being the biggest social change since World War II in terms of mass structural, redeployment, essentially. And I think, honestly, once we start taking climate change seriously in a governmental way, it's going to be an even bigger change than what we're seeing with COVID, and it's going to need to be managed a hell of a lot better. And social workers can really play a massive role in that, not just in facilitating a rollout or something of some program, but in actually designing new social structures to deal with the climate impact that is already upon us, but also to head off any more, because so much of it is linked, and so much of it needs to be done in a way that's coordinated. And I think the ability to create good systems design and be good advocators allows social work to be really important in that space. I think some of the immediate stuff is stuff exactly like what you're doing, Andrew, that raising awareness, putting the word out there, talking about it. A lot of people have solutions. And, a lot of people are quick to point out problems as well. But if we're all talking and able to share those ideas, then we can get more and more people helping pulling carbon out of the atmosphere again in some big projects or designing transit corridors or whatever needs to be done.
I think, what I've taken from that is activity and activism as being some of the key themes, the need for the social work profession to get involved hands-on in some of these initiatives. I mean, you mentioned COVID-19 there, and this is not the sort of context to discuss COVID-19 because it's a massive subject and it would require a podcast all of its own. And perhaps we will get one of those later on. But I just, some of the parallels that have been drawn very quickly between COVID-19, for instance, and climate change in terms of the needed response. For instance, the need to listen to scientific advice and take scientific risk assessment seriously and act upon it. the need for strong government leadership to actually back those assessments and adequate and proper funding to make the strategic activities, viable, proper amount of funding. As some of those parallels, I think, are very useful to be thinking about. But look, staying with that, sort of activist aspect of social work, I mean, it touches upon an older tradition there's always been present, my understanding, within the social work profession. I mean, I sort of trained in the 80s. I must admit, I didn't encounter it a lot, but I know, from reading around the topic, that it's always been there, a radical transformative framing for social work action, that, it's a valid and important role for the social work to be involved with the major challenges of the day. And now we're talking about the physical challenges. Eco-social work is emphasizing the physical challenges. It's largely in the past been about the social challenges, but we now know that there's such a close, very close connection between the two: social justice, environmental justice. So let's just stay with that for a moment. It's I suppose it's always the case, there's a vanguard of ideas that are floating around. We've talked about some of the theorists, you encountered early on, going back perhaps almost 10 years now. But, what about the mainstream, thinking about the mainstream now of social work practice in this country in 2021, to ask that sort of provocative question, the so what question, almost, unnecessary for people like yourself and myself, who are interested in this, and absolutely convinced that social work needs to go down this path of greater activism around physical environmental challenges. But why should the mainstream social work profession in this country be involved with climate change problems and other sustainability issues, as you've just outlined? Let's just nail it down for those listeners out there in cyberspace.
Yeah. I always struggle with this question, because I feel like I don't need to validate myself or the issue or the need to respond. But there are those naysayers, whatever you want to call them, that will say why to anything you're trying to do. I think in this space, the short answer is just justice. This is our planet. This is our home. I would put it to anyone listening that why wouldn't justice advocates be concerned in this space? It's probably the greatest existential threat we've ever faced. And, if governments of the world can have this kind of a reaction to a virus, and yet we can't coordinate to have a reaction to the chance that we're cooking ourselves, we need more and more people advocating in this space. So we can't afford to have people asking why. That's just ridiculous. It's upon us. If you can't see it happening, there's something wrong with you. The 2019 fires were scary as hell. And peace to everyone up in the Northern Hemisphere, because they're going through a bit at the moment with fires and floods and landslides. I'm a little bit worried, to be honest, about what our summer will bring here, especially if we have a dry one again. Rainforest burning is not something that I can even still now get my head around. So I don't think that's a question I need to answer. Anyone that asks me that seriously is probably maybe going to get a bit of a slap. We don't need to ask why. We need to get on with fixing things up.
I must admit, I couldn't agree more with you, personally. I suppose it's almost that thing about the need for balance, almost in the journalistic, supposedly robust media environment, where you're supposed to get a balance of views. But look, it is a no-brainer from my perspective as well. I mean, I was joking a little bit at the beginning of the interview in terms of the cold weather, in my particular neck of the woods in Toowoomba in southeast Queensland. But we know that the winters are getting shorter all the time in Australia, which might suit some people, but the reality is that what comes after the winter is a no doubt intensified summer. As you just pointed to. This stuff is obvious to many of us, but again, I suppose just playing the sort of devil's advocate here, or being naive, if you like, for the benefit of the interview, just spelling this stuff out. And another theme in each of these podcast interviews, as we move through the sequence of past, present, and future, we've been looking at some of the past influences upon you in terms of your interest in eco-social work, some of your thinking around the present situation and the mainstream. But I then ask each guests to actually, dream a little in a creative and positive way, ask them to vision and give me their personal vision, if you like, about where eco-social work might take us or where it needs to take us in the future. So, to cut to the chase on that one, what do you think the future could hold for eco-social work interventions as a body of practice within the social work mainstream in Australia, say over the next 2 to 10 years, however you want to cut that up?
Okay, well, I like, Andrew, that I get to dream a bit. That's good. I probably, as people will have already understood, I tend to go out to the macro pretty quick anyway, so getting grandiose is not a problem. I think in terms of body of practice as a phrase, scope of practice, all that sort of stuff, and even the concept of a discipline itself, I think we really are going to move into a space where we're working transdisciplinarian, because we can't do this without economists, ecologists, agronomists, whoever, it can't be just social work. But I think for me, what makes social work so important is, one, the holism for justice. I mean, we can't really have environmental justice until we start looking at the exploitation of female small landholders in agrarian sort of societies. We can't move forward really without dealing with racism, and its effect on land ownership and food production and many other ways. So we need that holism. Social work needs to be there for that. It also needs to be there for the coordination role, the systems mapping, the systems design, the advocacy, the communication skills. Every now and then, maybe use of silence. That's always fun. Even just in day-to-day practice, in micro stuff, you can still be looking also at how your clients, in whatever capacity you see clients in, how their access is to fresh and clean water and air, how their access is to peaceful time in nature, what their access is to shade and other ways to protect themselves from elements, shelter, obviously, and that's kind of an assessment phase, I guess. That can be part of any sort of assessment phase. But it's also some of the climate projects, some of the activist movements, some of the ways that we can change the way we live as individuals can be part of a therapeutic alliance, can be part of helping someone progress in the goals and their mood. So it can be micro in practice as well. And I think at a meso level, it's all the sort of networking that we can do, including within our own structures, the AASW branches and the national board. There is the National Advisory Panel on Climate Action, of course, as well. So to go from grandiose back down to micro level, I think there's lots that can be done all the way along that sort of micro to macro line.
You've touched upon, that's a nice continuum there, the micro, meso, macro, embedding practice, embedding eco-social work ideas and approaches into your direct client work, networking with colleagues around eco-social work ideas part as a way of actually just determining how those approaches can be embedded in practice, and then also playing a more political structured advocacy role at a higher level. I know, in fact, that you just to touch upon that last point, because I know it's something that you've actually had some direct experience of this year. Do you want to say something briefly? I understand that you went down to Canberra on an advocacy mission, in a sense, with another colleague to argue for a better strategic effort coming out of the federal government level, linking climate change to health outcomes. The Climate and Health Alliance, that very, sort of creative and hard-hitting organisation that's been around for about 10 years. Do you want to say anything about that, just as a sort of little brief example, a vignette of some advocacy work?
I think anyone that doesn't know about the Climate and Health Alliance definitely needs to get involved. I think I really have a lot of respect for what they're putting together. It's approaching climate action from a health perspective. So the Climate and Health Alliance is, I think, about 45 now, peak health bodies, including the AASW. And yeah, we went down to Canberra. There's about 35 of us, and split into groups and went and spoke to ministers and senators. And it was good. I mean, advocacy stuff, often you'll speak to those who are willing to speak to you. So there's an element of preaching to the converted, I guess. But basically it was trying to get people to commit to actions that would bring forth a national framework for climate action, actually as legislation, which, it's kind of silly that we don't have that already. It's kind of ridiculous, but that's what KAHA are trying to do, and that's very good. I've just gotten an email from one of the KAHA staff members actually about visiting my local member here, who's Karen Andrews, so that might be coming up soon as well. But yeah, I mean, that's sort of, I consider that kind of meso level, I guess. That's working with an alliance, a network, to try and advocate, to try and coordinate advocacy efforts. And yeah, they're super important. I think the Climate and Health Alliance are great.
And it struck me, Benny, I mean, I know they've, been pushing that sort of link for a long time, but, trying to link it back to social work specifically, again, for listeners, making some of the bridges, I suppose, between the social dimension of social work, has been there, forever, back since the 70s, social systems focus and all that. But, that more recent discussion about the social determinants of health and well-being, which a lot of social workers would be more than familiar with, in terms of the income levels of their clients, their housing provision or lack of it, their food security and stuff like that. And now we're sort of bridging this over to understand that it's also about the physical determinants of health, the impact of heat waves, for instance, smoke inhalation. I mean, you were talking about the 2019-2020 bushfire season that supposedly killed possibly up to 400 people in terms of exacerbating existing respiratory conditions. The smoke particles far more than were killed by the direct impacts of the fires. This sort of stuff that goes on almost behind the radar, but is increasingly understood. The physical determinants of health and well-being linking closely to the social determinants of health and well-being.
Yeah, that's right. And the Climate and Health Alliance have some pretty good stats up there for information there, because I, as a fella in the northern half of this country, we don't deal with bushfires anywhere near the southern half of the country, well, until 2019. But yeah, so the smoke inhalation and the heat wave stuff is not something that I have direct experience with, but it's I think the KAHA site says that it's the number one health killer, or number one human killer in an environmental regard. So that's it's intense.
And again, just bringing it down to brass tacks, in terms of, human, not just health and well-being, but actually survival. So it's very valid, to be involved with that sort of those topics. Look, Benny, you've given us a multitude of great ideas here, just those ideas about how we can actually move forward. I mean, one of the big themes from you is get active, get involved as a professional, as a worker. It's a valid thing to be doing. But just to round this up, this discussion, do you have any, shorter take-home messages, on that basis of, look, people tend to remember the first thing they heard, the last thing they heard, any sort of spiel. So do you have a sort of, like a concluding take-home message or one or two key ideas from the conversation today that might help sum up your particular take on the subject of eco-social work practice in Australia in 2021?
Well, I mean, Andrew, I could probably talk for a couple of days. You and I could probably talk for a couple of days about some of this.
We can edit it down. We can edit it down into a short file.
Yeah, there you go. Sure, everyone is safe. I would just raise a couple of points. I think yes, it is about ACT. I think that's what I'm always about. I think read the Drawdown Project, read Dark Yumi while you're at it, because cultural determinants are part of this space as well. I think. Get onto Climate and Health Alliance, get involved in advocacy in any way you can. In your team meetings at work, raise, people with bloody paper cups and whatever, raise whether they've got styrofoam in the kitchen at work, with your clients, use climate and understanding of environment around people as part of the assessment. But I think, ACT is good. And, we talk about emergency all the time as well. And that word just gives me the jitters. So I think it's really important that people pace themselves as well. You know, we're social workers, so we also understand self-care and supervision. So just, you know, do those as well. That's very important. And the only other thing I wanted to say, Andrew, is the state budget came out whenever it was last month, and I got the chance to kind of read through that on behalf of the branch, if you like, and have a look at what climate action stuff was in there. And although there was no section on climate action itself, there's quite a bit in there. But what strikes me, and I'm only raising this because this goes back to the idea of systems work and social workers being so important in that space, is there's something, I don't know, there's billions of dollars worth of infrastructure being built, new highways, new hospitals, the police are getting a bunch of new cars. There's all this funding for building. And I think why it's so important that this is understood as a systems concept is because they've got a renewable energy fund in there as well that's getting all this money. I think part of that's going towards gas, which is unfortunate. But you know, there's a state budget that has all this stuff about climate action in it, but a lot of it is reactive, and none of it's linked. So, you know, they're building new air conditioners in the schools. Are they going to be run by solar? Because there's also a solar program for schools, but other programs talking to each other. You know, it's the linkage and the systems connection that will make future budgets make a lot more sense. Because you read that and it's a lot of building, and then it has various stuff about environmental stuff in it. Why isn't all the new building green? Why aren't the building codes updated yet? Where's the support for alternative building industries? You know, that's why we need systems engagement in this. But take care of yourselves, guys.
I think, look, just before you go, Benny, that is such a valid point. I mean, one of the things that I came across, you know, I mean, going back to pure environmentalism, which is an area I came from, you know, training in environmental science back in the 70s and then up, you know, all the way through the subsequent decades, triple bottom line was a concept. Everything is joined to everything else, or at least it should be. We know that the environment is joined to the economy, which is joined to society in so many myriad ways. You know, an event in one area has so many knock-on effects in others. And so it's absolutely key and essential for the future that we plan in a systematic way that recognizes that holistic interdependency of economy, environment, and society. But as you rightly point out, even though despite the beautiful, you know, headline PR spiel about the budget and this sort of thing, and good though it is, you know, quite a large amounts of money supposedly going to stuff like, in Queensland state anyway, renewable energy zonation, green hydrogen manufacture, you know, for the use of steel refining, stuff like this, electric vehicle manufacture, as I understand it, you know, in Queensland.
It's got some good stuff in it.
Fantastic, but you know,
microgridding's in there as well, which I thought was really good.
Yeah, but are the dots being joined up? Where's the actual systematic plan that the public can go and access and see about this stuff? You know, I mean,
and where's the acknowledgement of that? I mean, I almost think we should do an acknowledgement at the start of meetings and days, courses and stuff, along the same lines as we do for First Nations people. Do the First Nations one first, then do a climate acknowledgement. You know, we need that level of appreciation that this is a truly trying time.
And I think, you know, again, in terms of what we've been doing today, we're talking about these ideas. Everyone, you know, is subscribing to this view that the more conversations we can have, you know, the very first step in getting this more visionary, but frankly, realistic, sustainable agenda properly integrated and functioning, as opposed to it simply being a sort of PR exercise, as it often has been in the past, is talking about it seriously and, you know, pushing our leaders and our decision makers to get serious on this stuff and start incorporating it and embedding it in budgetary planning, as you imply, and other, you know, policy and strategic decision-making processes.
Yeah, absolutely, Andrew, absolutely.
Well, look, anyway, that completes the interview, Benny. Fantastic, you know, last little pointer there. I just want to thank you. I know that you are a social worker who walks the talk on eco-social work and finds, you know, every single opportunity you can to embed it in your own work and put the message out there to others. So it's been an absolute delight to talk to you today. I'm certain.
Thanks, Andrew.
Well, it just goes without saying, and I'm certain you've given our audience some great ideas. which can help inform their own thinking. And that's part of the key idea behind this podcast series. Get them thinking, get them talking to colleagues, having conversations and collaborations around the subject of eco-social work adoption with their friends, colleagues in their employing organisations or professional associations. So it just remains for me, on behalf of the Householders Options to Protect the Environment organisation that's helped support this podcast series, to thank you so much for your comments today.
Thanks, man. Thank you.
You've been listening to a podcast episode in the series Eco-Social Work in Australia, produced for Householders Options to Protect the Environment. Please consult the episode text notes for possible references to topics discussed and relevant contact details should you wish to respond to anything you've heard. My name is Andrew Nicholson, producer of the series, and thank you for listening.